Hi, in this video I'm going to be showing you how you can paint a sea turtle using your watercolors. For this picture you will need a piece of paper. You need a paper that's nice and thick. The page that I'm using is 250 grams per meter squared, but as long as it's watercolor grade that's fine. You'll need a pencil, your watercolor paints, water, as well as a little bit of salt for a trick that I'm showing you at the end. Let's get started. Right, so first let's draw our sea turtle and have a plan for it. So we're going to start with his shell, which is a big oval. When you're drawing your oval, remember to leave space for the turtle's arms and legs as well as its head. So don't draw this great big oval and not leave space for everything else. I'm making mine slightly more egg-shaped than oval, so a bit thicker at the top, skinnier at the bottom. Okay, once you are happy with the shell, the shape of the shell, you can add the head in. So try and get it in at the center of your oval. Comes up a little bit, goes out slightly, and then comes together at a point at the top. Try and make the head as symmetrical as possible. Right, so his arms, or the fins that are in the front, are going to be like a triangular shape, almost lying next to the shell. So you're first going to go out as if that's the top of the triangle, and then come down, and the right hand side of the triangle should go against the shell there. Once you're happy with that triangular shape, you want to round it off a little bit, so make it nice and rounded. A bit of a curve at the bottom. Right, now the trick is to get the other side looking the same. Mark off the bottom of it and the top of it on the other side of my page. This will help me make sure that I get it as symmetrical as possible. Right, and then you can use these measurements to help you draw the other one. Okay, just round it off nicely. Right, we're going to do the back legs now, or back flippers. For these, you just need to draw 2 lines going out on either side. And then it kind of comes down at an angle. So I find it helpful to get the general shape of it first and then add the details in. So we're just going to add in these little, I want to say toes, but I know that's not right. Right, once you've got the back legs drawn, we're going to add some details onto the shell. So I'm first just going to start by drawing a slightly smaller oval inside the first oval that I've drawn. If you were drawing a specific turtle, you would obviously look at the pattern on their back and copy that. And what I'm going to do in this space is just draw small oval shapes. You can make each one slightly different. I think that helps the picture look nicer. Just leave a little bit of a gap between them. Right, and then we're going to do a pattern of hexagons on the inside. So what I'm going to do is start with half a hexagon at the top. Just under his head, I'm going to draw a straight line and then draw 2 lines at angles going to the edge of the shell. Right, then underneath it, I'll leave a little gap, draw a straight line again, draw the diagonal lines going out. Now for the bottom half of it, we'll draw some diagonal lines going in and draw a straight line. As you're going, try and keep these lines as similar as possible, the same length. So we're just drawing a line of hexagons down the center of the back. Hexagons can be a little bit tricky, but also remember it's a picture of an animal, so if it's slightly different or not perfectly geometric, it will actually look a bit more realistic. If you can finish off your final hexagon, you can. If you can't, it's fine. Just make it like the top one where it goes off the edge of the shell. And now we're going to draw 2 more rows of hexagons on either side of these. You can use the hexagons you've already drawn to help you draw these ones so that the pattern looks more uniform. Each of these shapes has a little gap between it, so I'm not letting the shapes touch each other. And the final thing is just to add a few details to his face. Now they've got quite wrinkly little necks, so we're going to draw a couple of wrinkles on there. And his eyes are going to be on the side of his head, at the widest part of the head. and you can almost draw it like a little C shape. Make sure that you make them the same length and about the same width, so as symmetrical as you can. What we're going to do now is mix 4 washes of green and blue. If you only have 1 green and 1 blue, you can mix the 2 colors together. For one of the washes, you could add a lot more green and just a little bit of blue. And for another one, you could add a lot of blue and a little bit of green. Adding a bit of yellow to it will also change the color of it. So you can have 4 different colors or make 4 different colors with your 2 colors. Right, I'm going to mix my washes now. Right, so I'm first starting by loading up my brush with some water and putting it on my punnets. If you don't have these little wells in the lid of your watercolors, you can use an ice cube tray, that works really well, or even the lid of an ice cream tub, because as you can see here, my little blobs of color are sticking to themselves, they're not running all over the place. So a flat surface will also work. I want 4 different shades of blue and green. Right, now I'm just going to load my brush up. So I'm lying my brush flat over the paint and just twirling it. So I'm rolling the brush in the paint and then adding it to the water to create my watercolor wash. Now the more paint you add, the brighter the color will be. Once you've done it, just take a scrap piece of paper, any kind of paper is fine, and test your color out. Then I'm going to move on to my next one. Again, if you wanted to make a different tone, you could just add a little bit of blue to your wash or add a little bit of yellow to make different shades of green. Okay, let's test that one out, nice and bright. Right, rolling my brush around in the blue now. So the more paint you add, the brighter the color is going to be. Usually with watercolors, you start with light colors, light washes, and then you make them darker and darker as you add more detail. Which we're going to be having a look at in this video. Right, so I'm testing my 2 blues now. Okay, these 2 blues are kind of similar, so I'm just going to add a little bit of green to one of them. I'm going to add some of my darker green. Mix it in. A bit more blue to the wash. There we go, so I'm happy with my colors. Now what I'm going to do is start with the turtle's arms and legs. And I'm going to make those green, but I'm going to use some of my blue to be a darker shading on it. So what I'm going to start with is just my nice bright green. And I'm painting the leg, just putting a wash on the leg and covering it. Now while this is still wet, I'm going to rinse off my brush and add a bit of blue just against the shell. So when you mix 2 colors together that are both wet, that's called a wet on wet technique. If you're finding the colors are not blending together nicely, just dip your brush in some water. It will help it along. So I've kind of done an L of this darker shading, and then there's lighter green on that side. And add a little bit more green to this side too. Again, an L of the blue. Blue and green blend together really easily, so it's 2 nice colors to try out for the first time. Just going to mix a little bit more of my green here. It's running low. So I'm going to paint his arms. Now you want to leave a little bit of white just on this edge here of the fin. If you have painted it already and it's already too late, you haven't left a bit of white, all you do is take some paper towel and dab it, and it will pick the paint up off the page. Just don't rub it, you just need to do a little dab. And like with the bottom, we're going to add some dark shading. Just going to do the dark shading on the inside of the leg, so the part that's closest to the shell. You can use a bit of water to help the 2 colors blend together. Right, so I'm going to go on to the other side, paint it green. Oh, I've forgotten to do my light shading, so I'm just going to take my towel. I've got it nice and thin, and I'm just going to dab off a section there. Okay, then some of my dark blue on the inside, closest to the shell. And to dab off a little bit of the paint at the bottom too. Now, if you wanted to, if you have some salt, You can sprinkle a few pieces of salt on this while it dries. And what this will do, it creates a really interesting water effect. So salt absorbs water, and watercolors are based in water. So what happens is if you put salt onto a watercolor painting, the water gets absorbed and a really strong pigment of color gets left there, and it creates a really cool speckled effect. What you need to do is just leave the salt on the page and let it dry for a bit, and then you can dust it off once it's dry. I'm just going to go ahead and paint his head now. Okay, so again, like the rest of his body, I'm going to start with the green. Just paint over the whole thing with a little bit of green. You can leave a little patch, and then take some of the blue to darken it up along the edge of the shell, and then just pick one side of the head to make slightly darker. This looks like it needs a bit more green. Okay, and again, if you wanted to put a couple of salt crystals on the head too, you could. Just stealing some from here. Right, the stronger your colour is, the more these salt crystals will show up at the end. Right, what we're going to do next is paint the inside of the shell, and this is to give the head and the limbs a chance to dry. If we go ahead and start painting on the outside now, our colours are going to run into each other, and we want a nice clean line. So what I'm going to do is do the shell more of the blue colours. So for the body, we started with green and added some blue. What I'm going to do for the shell is start with some blue and maybe add a little bit of green to it. Okay, so I'm going to start with my blue, and all I'm going to do is paint the outline of my hexagon. So each of the hexagons, just paint the outline of it, and you can dip your brush in water, add some water to it, and just swirl it around. If you wanted to, you could add a dash of green. I'm adding my darker green now. Okay, so I'm starting with this blue, outlining my hexagon in the blue, and then just dipping my brush in water, moving it around the inside. Don't forget, you could add a dash of your green to it. Doesn't matter if there's slight variations in the colours on the shell. And dab off some of this paint. A bit brighter than you'd like. Dip my brush in the water, lighten it up. If it's still brighter than you'd like, you can continue doing that. Even add a bit of green in. Right, you can check on our salt crystals now, see how they're doing. Oh, they need a little longer. What we're going to do now is just give our picture a bit of time to dry, because when we do this next outside layer, we don't want colours to run into each other. So we're just going to give it a few minutes to dry properly before we move on. Right, what I did with mine was just put the hairdryer over it. If you're impatient like me, that's a quick tip to help your watercolor painting dry faster. And you can see I took the salt crystals off the legs, and it's created this splotchy effect. Kind of reminds me of being underwater or water, so I thought it was a nice thing to add to a sea turtle picture. What we're going to do now is paint the outside of the turtle's shell, and what I'm going to do is try and use slightly different colors. So I'm going to mix some of my colors together. I'm going to take some of my darker green and add it to my blue, and maybe add a little bit of my blue to my light green. So we're just mixing up the colors a little bit. Right, and we're just going to go and paint each of these little squares around the edge of the turtle. Mix your colors together, try and make each one slightly different. I think it's fun to have more than one color in a little square. If one of them comes out a little darker than you'd like, just dab it with your paper towel. Remember, don't rub, just dab. Right, once you've gone around the edge, what we're going to do is mix a slightly darker color and add some details to the limbs and the head. So what I'm going to do is make a mixture of a blue and a green and just make it a bit darker than the other washes that I have. So I'm just adding a little bit more paint to it, so it's going to make it a stronger color. Remember to test your color, see that you're happy with it. It's looking too blue. So I'm going to add a bit more green to it. Be careful not to check your color too quickly, because sometimes you've just dipped it in the paint and you just dab it in the water and you put it on there and you're just seeing the paint that you've picked up. So make sure that you've mixed it thoroughly before you check it. Okay, I'm a bit happier with that color. Just add a little bit of water to it. Now, if you have a really tiny little brush, you can use that. So I'm going to show you both ways. So I've got a nice thin brush. I dip my paintbrush in it, and I can do some of these little wrinkles on the turtle's neck. And paint his eyes. Just going to add a bit of water there, blend these colors together. If you are using a thicker brush, all you need to do is just wet it and really squeeze the end of it into a nice little tip. So I'm squeezing it together with my fingers and I get a nice sharp tip. So you could use that and add a bit of shadow. So this is the dry on wet technique. It's also called glazing, when you put one color over another color. And the first color is dry. So our bottom layer is dry and we're putting wet paint on it now. So you can see the colors don't bleed together at all. If I wanted to blur it a little bit, I could add a bit of water. Let those colors blend a bit more. Doing a really thin line of the darker color around the outside edge. Okay, on these bottom legs. Again, I've squeezed the end of my paintbrush to make it a nice sharp line. I'm just going to go in between each of these little, I call them toes, but that's just not correct. I just can't think of the right description. So I'm just outlining each of those. Then if you wanted to add a bit of water to it, help it become more like a shadow. So with watercolors, the more layers of color you add, then the more depth your picture will have. So I'm blending lots of these dark colors in. If I let this dry, I could add another layer of the really thin dark shading. Then I would have 3 layers of color. So your picture just looks richer and richer the more layers of color you add to it. Right, this leg, it wasn't quite as dry as the other legs, and now the colors are bleeding a bit too much, so I'm just going to dab it off and leave it to dry a little longer before I try and add more detail to it. Right, what we can do is take the salt off the inside of the turtle, of his back. I just added a few pieces. Again, it's totally your choice. If your picture was totally dry, you could just blow the salt off, but because I've got wet patches on my picture, I'm just picking it up. Right, so I just gave my picture another go with the hairdryer, and I've taken the salt off the back. You can see it's come out really well here. Almost looks like little barnacles or something like that sticking on the turtle's back. And I'm going to finish off this bottom leg here, and then just looking at my picture, I would say I need a little bit more dark shading on the top of his neck so that it's clear that there's a difference between his shell and his body. If you wanted to, you could add a bit more dark shading onto the edges of each of these little hexagons, but I'm going to leave mine as it is. So as I said earlier, the more layers of color you add to your picture, the more depth it will have. So if you do go and just add a little bit of dark shading around the edges of each of these hexagons, it's going to add more detail or more depth. Okay, so I'm just going to go along here, add my dark shading onto the bottom of this foot. can use a little bit of water to help you blend the colours. Alternatively, you use a lighter wash. So if once you put it on you find, oh, this wash is too dark, just adding a spot of water to it can help you save it. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more dark at the top here. Maybe you could just go with one more dark line along the inside of his fins. And then I'll just show you an example of if you wanted to darken up the hexagons. I would just choose 1/2 of the hexagon to make darker. Again, if you find your wash is too dark, just mix some water in with it and it will just give each of them a little bit more depth. Right, my page is starting to get a bit wobbly and a bit tired, so I'm going to stop there. But I hope you had fun with me today experimenting with mixing watercolors together, practicing shading and adding details. And I hope you're finding watercolors a little bit less intimidating now. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you have any questions about watercolors, leave them in the comment section below. And why not consider subscribing to our channel? We put up new videos every week.